Hey guys, welcome to Crater Mania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to finally welcome you guys back to my 500 movies in 2025 series here on YouTube. Um, and I say finally because it's been over a week now since I did my last video on here, which was part one of the Masters of Macabre series that I'm continuing tonight with part two finally. Um, and the reason for the delay on that, guys, and I do apologize to everybody, that had watched the first part, and I promised part two within a few days after that, and then I just delayed it to the next day, and just and here we are over a week later. I'm finally doing part two, but like I said, I do want to apologize for everybody that did watch part one and we're waiting, for me to talk about part two. Um, and the reason for that is it's really a long story. This has been a really crazy week. This whole past week. So one of the part of the reason as to why this has been delayed is I did leave my job this past Tuesday after working there for over 6 years. And I won't get into that because there's just a lot of crazy stuff involved that's very uninteresting. And but I just I had a lot of talks with my wife about it. I had talks with my supervisor, just everyone at work. That knew that it was that it was coming, because it's really been a long time coming for me leaving that position. Just the last year, maybe year and a half. Just been really unhappy at that position, and just some other things kind of came into play that just furthered that decision to leave even more. And I'll just leave it at that, because I said, it's a very long story and not that interesting. And but I just think it was for the best. I think there's better things out there that await me. I think that, everything happens for a reason. And I think I've stated that a few times here on this channel. But yeah, Crater Mania is going to bounce back, so don't worry about me. Don't worry about that, because I've already got a few other jobs lined up, that I'm interviewing for this week. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to getting on the payroll again, I guess is to say. Take it to the pay window, daddy, as Dusty Rhodes would say. Um, but yeah, so that's the biggest reason why I just had to keep delaying this video, because I just had so much going on this past week, and was just so stressed out and full of anxiety. And you guys get it, you understand. I'm sure you all have had your situations you've been in where you just don't have that feeling to put energy into something like what I'm doing here. But everything's good now. I'm finally back. And I have been watching movies during this time. So even though these movies I'm covering tonight, I watched over a week ago, I have been continuing watching movies over this past week. And I'll get into that towards the end of the show. What's next after this Masters of Macabre little mini series that I'm doing. So I guess we could just go ahead and jump into part two now, the Master of Macabre. So this is movies number 213 through 217 of the 500 movies in 2025, and we're continuing. I can't even talk tonight. We're continuing to talk about the Masters of Macabre, like the top three Masters of Macabre, in my opinion: Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, and Peter Cushing. And on part one, I talked about two different movies, which was The Oblong Box and Scream and Scream Again, which both of those featured Vincent Price. But I think we did a lot more talking about Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing on part one. So as I stated, before, Vincent Price is my favorite horror icon of all time. I mean, just my favorite horror movie person of all time. Vincent Price to me is the man. So I wanted to put a little bit more emphasis on his name and um, just talk about him some more for part two. And I mean, what better way to start off part two than talking about one of my favorite Vincent Price movies of all time? And that's The Abominable Dr. Phibes from 1971. And and as all my dear fellow classic horror aficionados out there, and all my disciples of the what is the macabre out there, Vincent Price. Let me tell you, if you haven't had the pleasure of watching The Abominable Dr. Phibes from 1971, I think you're missing out on a true dark jewel in what is the proverbial crown of Vincent Price's incredible career. Now, as a longtime admirer of Vincent Price, I mean this film is just an absolute triumph, I guess, for his career. Just that it's that perfect blend of gothic tragedy, that dark humor. Just there's a lot of inventive horror involved here. Just this totally unparalleled style, and it's all anchored by Vincent Price's captivating performance here. Um, Now, let's talk about what this movie is. I mean, it's well, first of all, it's just pure, perfection from Vincent Price, in my opinion, and I think it's far more than just a horror film. It is an absolute experience. It tells the story of Dr. Anton Phibes, who is this brilliant concert organist, and also he's a doctor of theology. So, with that known, you already know that this character is just going to be awesome. Um, and he was believed to be dead. For years after this horrific car crash. And this accident occurred as he was racing home after hearing news of his beloved wife Victoria's death on the operating table, which is 4 years prior to the events in this film. But Phibes, he survived. And he came out of it horribly scarred and just unable to speak normally. Um, and he reconstructs his whole face with all these like very cool prosthetics, and and just he regains his voice through this kind of acoustic technology thing where he like hooks up to his neck. And his heart, however, though, and even though he was able to basically rebuild himself like the $6 million man, well, not exactly like that, but his heart, though, however, is still broken, and he's consumed by this purpose, which is vengeance. And he blames the entire medical team who attended his wife's surgery, for her death. And, he orchestrates this series of all these elaborate murders, which is, inspired by the 10 plagues of Egypt. And yes, the plagues in the film might differ, slightly from the biblical ones, um, but that only adds to the film's really twisted and creative genius, I think. So Phibes, he's aided in this mission by this stunningly silent and mysterious Volnavia, who is this female character who serves as both his assistant and just a living piece of the film's whole, um, Art Deco aesthetic. So The film follows Inspector Trout and Dr. Vesalius, which who was the lead surgeon, um, and they're racing against time to understand and to stop Phibes. Piecing together this kind of bizarre motive, um, and just the even more bizarre methods. From bats and boils to frogs and rats. The death scenes here are like set pieces. They're darkly funny. They're creatively gruesome and just unforgettable. Um, and let's be honest. We come to this film, first and foremost, um, for Vincent Price. And he delivers in spades here. I think even beneath the layers, of the prosthetics, that hide his familiar face. His well, it's not really. It's hiding. It's not hiding his familiar face because the prosthetics is Vincent Price's face, but that's just the those prosthetics of his actual face. It's just hiding his face below. Just that his whole presence. The point I'm trying to make is his presence is just colossal here. He channels so much as he does with almost all of his characters. Through his eyes, his gestures, and his voice. I mean, his voice is one of the most recognizable voices in history, and especially when it comes to film. I believe. Um, and like I said, though he doesn't speak conventionally, his voice is delivered, through these recordings and these devices, just kind of giving it this kind of artificial quality that is it's just pure Vincent Price. I mean, I think this was a role that was created for him that nobody else could have pulled off. Just because where you're not seeing his mouth move throughout the film, but you're hearing his voice, and I just think that was genius to include such an iconic voice for that role by choosing Vincent Price. He just he imbues that whole character just with this kind of deep, tragic, melancholy, but beneath all the vengeful rage. And he portrays Phibes not just as a monster, but as this man that's consumed by grief and just this kind of misguided sense of justice. Um, and his love for Victoria is you feel it is very genuine and it's heartbreaking. I mean, you feel sorry for him, which really makes his actions, however horrific, but just kind of in a way understandable in a very on a very warped emotional level. Um, and just this performance, is just I think is a masterclass, in acting through limitation and just still commanding the screen. Um, and if you've seen the film, you know exactly what I mean by that. But moreover, I guess the film allows Vincent Price to fully lean into the theatricality, and just that dark wit that he was known for. And his lair, which is filled with all these kind of mechanical, like almost like animatronic band or whatever, with the musical instruments, and him in the centerpiece of all of it, because he is the concert organist, after all. Um, and just throw in all these kind of biblical motifs, and it is just a perfect stage for his performance. I feel like this is one of his greatest films of all time. Um, and he just kind of conducts this whole symphony of death throughout the film, just with an elegance that only Vincent Price, I think, like I said, could pull off. Um, but the whole Art Deco production design in this film is one of the things that really makes this film work. Um, it's one of the most appealing things about the film, in my opinion. Just that whole production design is glorious. I feel it is amazing. And this, this was directed by a guy named Robert Fewest of West. I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, so I apologize if I'm getting that wrong. Um, and but this film was just a feast for the eyes. I mean, visually is beautiful. Um, and Dr. Phibes' mansion, it doesn't feel just like a normal location in a horror film or just a film in general. It feels more like its own character, because it's filled with these geometric patterns and these rich colors and just these very weird contraptions and just the period details that that create a world that's both opulent and unnerving, I guess I should say. Um, but going back to the character of Volnavia, she's kind of often dressed in these very striking, sometimes bizarre costumes, and she moves like through the film like a silent, elegant phantom, I guess, just through this whole space. Um, and this kind of visual style that they went with, I feel it just elevates, that film beyond standard horror and places it kind of firmly in that realm of very unique and stylish cinema. Um, I think it just perfectly, complements, Price's kind of theatricality that he's always been known for. Um, I guess I should say, while Vincent Price is, the undeniable star here, just the supporting cast is excellent. So I mentioned Dr. Vesalius earlier, and he's played by Joseph Cotton, and he does fantastic. And just kind of portraying that increasingly desperate and that target of Phibes' wrath. And then also you had the police who were led by Peter Jeffries' character Inspector Trout. It just kind of provides these moments of like dry humor, amidst all the horror. And he's one of my favorite parts actually. I think about the film just because he really reminds me of. I can't think of his even name. The main character from the Pink Panther movies, um, Peter Sellers. So, but not in the way he looks or anything, but just like the way like the he portrays the character. So, I really enjoy Inspector Trout in this movie, and we'll talk more about him in the next movie as well. But and you just see all these other recognizable faces like Hugh Griffith as as the rabbi or Terry Thomas, who's just briefly in the film. It just really adds to that film's very unique texture. And I spoke about her a couple times already, but his assistant, Volnavia, who was played by Virginia North, and I believe this was Virginia North's last film. Like she didn't have a very long film career before she retired. But yeah, I think this was her very last film that she did. And like I said before, she definitely adds to the film's surreal atmosphere. Just a silent, beautiful presence, in this kind of world of grotesque death. And before I move on, I have to mention, as one of the main plot points is the death of Phibes' wife, Victoria. So we only see a few glimpses here and there throughout the film of Victoria, and the images we see, the photos, everything is of the legendary Caroline Monroe, but she was uncredited in this film. Um, but I just think it's really cool that they used her to be in that kind of role of Victoria. I think it's just a touching reminder, of that love that drives the madness of Dr. Phibes here. Um, and going back to the director, Robert Fest, I'm sorry, I'm butchering it. I'm sure, but he's the director here, and um, just very, instrumental in crafting, the film's distinctive tone and look. And he's known for that kind of strong, visual sense and kind of often theatrical, surreal style. Um, Notably for like his work from the classic TV series The Avengers, um, and just his if you're familiar with the Avengers, because I mean I know that's a it's a bit for some people's time, but definitely if you've never watched that TV show, go check it out. It's classic TV show. But just his direction, here brings the whole script's very bizarre premise to life, with just ensuring that the film is always, kind of visually engaging and just maintains its balance between horror and comedy and tragedy. Um, I think he understood, how to frame Vincent Price and the incredible sets to just that maximum effect. You know what I mean? Um, but you know the Abominable Dr. Phibes, you know, it initially, from what I understand, received mixed reviews. But over time, it has rightfully gained a significant and just devoted cult following over the years. And why? Well, because it's unlike anything else. It's unique blend of horror, dark comedy, that whole Art Deco design, just and at times a very genuinely moving, if twisted performance that makes it stand out. Um, it's been praised specifically for Vincent Price's performance, and rightfully so. Um, it's dark humor, and that kind of unforgettable aesthetic about it is a huge reason why this movie has such a following that it does. Um, from what I read in my research, it even made Time Out London's list of top 100 horror films. Um, and I mean, some people would argue that Time Out London's list of top 100 horror films, uh, some of the choices on that list are questionable. But like I said, that's their list. I'm gonna have my list. So and so is gonna have their list. When it comes to films, just like everything else in this world, things are subjective. Um, but personally, I'm gonna have to agree with Time Out London here. This movie definitely deserves to be on the top 100 horror films of all time. Um, and I just think, so many other people agree with that as well. And it just shows that it's a testament to the enduring appeal that the film has. Um, but its legacy also lies, in its kind of singular vision. It demonstrated that horror could be stylish and inventive and darkly funny. Just without kind of sacrificing, you know, these the genuineness of it. If that is that a word, genuineness? But it paved the way for, I think, films that weren't afraid to embrace a more theatrical and less realistic approach to terror. Um, and of course, it gave us one of Vincent Price's most iconic, memorable, and just sympathetic villains. And sympathetic at times. Just a character that is so compelling that that he returned for a sequel. Dr. Fives Rises Again, which is the next film that we're going to be talking about. But I guess in conclusion, for a Vincent Price fan like myself, the Abominable Dr. Fives is just essential viewing. Whether you're just having some horror movies you want to watch, or if you're having a Vincent Price marathon, whatever. This movie is just essential viewing, in my opinion. It showcases everything that we love about Vincent Price, that theatricality, his intelligence, his ability to blend, menace with vulnerability, and just that perfect command, of the material that's involved, and just his voice. throughout the film. I mean, that's to me, that's one of the most um, identifiable things about Vincent Price is his voice. It's undeniable. I mean, it's one of the most unique and recognizable voices I think in history. Um, and another guy like that I would put in that same category would be Stan Lee. Um, but that's a story for another time. So we're not talking about Marvel movies or comics or anything tonight. Tonight we're talking about Vincent Price and Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. And what's going on, Born to Be Rad? Glad to see you in here, man. The man they call Crater. That's right. So, like I was just telling everyone, first of all, thanks for jumping in here, Garrett, for just a few minutes. But yeah, I took over a week break from doing this, but I'm back now. And head on over if you're a wrestling fan, as I'm wearing my Eddie Guerrero shirt tonight. If you're a wrestling fan, head on over to deadpit.com and their YouTube channel, as we do a little sub series through that channel called the WrestleManiacs. So last night, me, the creepy Kentuckian from Dead Pit, Garrett from Born to Be Rad, and Stuntman Mark. We all did our post show review of the Money in the Bank pay per view or premium live event, whatever you want to call it. And we just kind of, bullshit about some other wrestling stuff. So if you're a wrestling fan, after this video, head on over to the Dead Pit channel and check that out. But yeah, again, thanks for stopping in here, Garrett. I appreciate you, man. Um, but as I was saying though about Vincent Price, like I said, this his voice is recognizable. Just everything that I've talked about, is just what really makes this movie so interesting, and I feel like one of the greatest horror films of all time. The film itself is just this very glorious, stylish, inventive, and just darkly funny masterpiece of British horror. It's a testament to Vincent Price's power as a performer and just the director's vision. It's not just a film that I like. I mean, it's one that I absolutely adore. This film. So if you've never seen this movie, definitely dive into that world of Dr. Phibes. I promise you won't be disappointed. It's all part of the story. Hello, welcome to Have Good. Thanks, man. I appreciate that. Yeah, it is all part of the story. So moving on now, the next film I want to be talking about is the sequel to The Abominable Dr. Phibes, and that's Dr. Phibes Rises Again from 1972. Now, as much as I put over The Abominable Dr. Phibes, and it's undeniably a masterpiece of just macabre artistry. The sequel, Dr. Phibes Rises Again, is for me just that perfect continuation of that story. It's a very vibrant, outlandish, and just deeply satisfying, second act that allows Vincent Price to lean into the character's, just kind of tragic obsession even further. And it might just be another one of my favorite. I mean, I don't enjoy this one as much as I do the original. Um, but I still put Dr. Phibes Rises Again in on that list of my top Vincent Price films of all time. It's just this very I don't know, it's just a very dark piece of that Vincent Price legacy that he created over the years, and just that continuation of one of his greatest characters that he's ever portrayed is just it's amazing. If you've not watched The Abominable Dr. Phibes, you got to watch it, and then immediately after watch this movie, Dr. Phibes Rises Again. So the film picks up 3 years after that, that unforgettable finale from the first film, and we find the good doctor rudely awakened. It's not just the threat of demolition to this magnificent Art Deco abode that stirs him, but it's just the far more heinous crime of someone daring to interfere with this eternal vigil over his beloved Victoria. And here's where the adventure really truly blooms. I think so. This rival archaeologist, this which is played by Robert Quarry, and his character's name is Beaterbeck, I believe. He's kind of absconded, with this papyrus holding the the key to the legendary pool of eternal life. So for Phibes, this isn't just a mythological quest. It's the chance, perhaps the only chance, to resurrect his beloved Victoria. So this sets the stage for this kind of huge change of scenery. So Dr. Phibes, accompanied once again by this hauntingly beautiful Volnavia, but this time she is portrayed by Valley Kemp. So they pack up Victoria's glass coffin, and just everything that Fives pretty much has left after the destruction of this Art Deco mansion that he had from the first film. And so he heads for Egypt, and just the plot kind of transforms from this very static, elaborate revenge plot into this kind of dynamic race against time, and with this new set of adversaries for Doctor Fives. Um, so it's just a quest for resurrection, driven by that kind of same profound, if utterly warped at times, just that love that really fueled the first film, for his beloved Victoria, and just naturally, where Dr. Fives goes, um, all this theatrical death, I guess you could call it, follows him as well. And he's still pursued by that ever earnest, never quite catching him, Inspector Trout. We'll talk more a little bit about him later. But what really makes this film, I think, so great for a Vincent Price fan like myself, well, first of all, there's so much, and just it's Vincent Price himself first and foremost is the reason to love this. But just even behind his face, the prosthetics that he wears, and just communicating solely through that voice box in his neck, he just embodies that character so much like he did in the first film. And it just shows what a true genius of an actor that he is. And he conveys so much through posture, through just the kind of subtle tilt of his head, the gestures of his hands, and just that presence that he commands throughout the film. And Dr. Phibes is just that character of immense contradiction. He's brilliant yet insane. He's vengeful yet motivated by love. He's monstrous yet strangely sympathetic. So, and I think that's what makes that character one of the most interesting characters of all time in horror films. And Vincent Price just navigates all of this, that complexity of the character, just with effortless grace. You you really feel the depth, of his sorrow for Victoria, the that cold fury towards his rivals, and just that almost childlike glee in his elaborate schemes here. Um, it's a performance that really relies on pure, you know, unadulterated theatricality. Precisely that kind of role that Vincent Price was born to play. And just seeing him transport Phibes' unique brand of vengeance to this new environment in this film, it really allows him, to play with kind of slightly different nuances, adding layers to this kind of already fascinating character. But let's talk about the kills a little bit in this one. So while it kind of adheres to that similar themes of vengeance, structure as the first film, Dr. Fives rises again. It doesn't shy away from up in the ante and sheer inventiveness with these kills, like death by a giant fan, being meticulously shrunken into a dollhouse, melting in sand, and just this brutal, shocking death by falcon. they're just all these elaborate, darkly humorous, and just kind of executed with this flair that is purely Dr. Phibes. Um, they just aren't just these kind of random acts of violence. They are just these orchestrated performances. This macabre art installation curated by the Doctor himself. Um, and just for a fan who really appreciates that grotesque beauty that Price often embodied, these sequences are a very like weird, perverse delight for me to watch. I mean, just because they're and in a sense that like because they're so unrealistic and something that you would never think could happen in reality. I just think that's what makes the film so humorous and enjoyable. Um, and again, we have the same director from the first film, Robert Fuest. Sorry, once again, don't really know how to pronounce his last name, but just his direction once again here just is absolutely essential. Kind of having owned his distinctive visual flair on that, on the Avengers TV series, he brings that same, stylized, almost artificial beauty to the horror genre, look like we did with the first film, and again here continuing in the second film. He doesn't seem like he's, really interested in that kind of gritty realism. He kind of just creates this heightened, like operatic world where Art Deco kind of design those types of designs clash with all the kind of Egyptian environment. So these sets in this film are all the colors are popping and just every frame just feels deliberately composed here. And just this whole aesthetic that it brings is just I think another perfect canvas for Vincent Price's kind of theatrical performance that he's always been known for, and just that unique tone that this film brings, much like the first film did. Um, so it's less about building like jump scares and just more about kind of immersing you in Dr. Phibes' bizarre and beautiful and dangerous reality. Um, and this kind of stylistic confidence, I think, is what truly elevates the whole uh, franchise, if you want to call it that, of the Dr. Phibes films. Even though there is just two Dr. Phibes films, but you can still consider it a franchise. Um, but I just think that's what really elevates those films. Kind of that whole stylistic confidence, because beyond all the typical horror fare that's come to be known, I guess, over the years. Um, but for a Vincent Price fan like myself and so many other Vincent Price fans out there, like I said, I think these films are cornerstones of his career. They just really solidified his late career persona, that the cultured, slightly, eccentric, often tragic figure that is capable of both, immense charm and just kind of terrifying menace. And Dr. Phibes is the ultimate expression of that kind of contradictory appeal. Um, just these films, influence, like I said, with the first film, they influence, future horror by showcasing just that power of that elaborate, um, villainous methods that could be, as iconic as they were gruesome. Um, but I think more than that, they proved that horror could blend, dark comedy and gothic tragedy and just, a very stunning, almost art house level of visual design. Um, Dr. Phibes rises again. It didn't just replicate the formula from the first film; it expands it. Just proving it has this enduring strength to it. And like I said, I even though I don't enjoy this film as much as I do the original, I still don't look at it as a lesser film, if you know what I mean. It's another kind of like if like the Back to the Future movies or the Lord of the Rings movies or the Star Wars films. Like it's they're all like one big story, and it's just they're all this kind of triumphant continuation. So the same thing can be said here with the Dr. Phibes films. And this one just it takes everything that made that first film a cult classic, which is Vincent Price's just incomparable performance. Excuse me. Just the direction and the stunning visuals here, that dark humor, the elaborate kills, even though not maybe not very that realistic. And it just it transports it to this kind of fresh, exciting setting in Egypt, and it's a very bigger, you know, s- some people would think bolder, but and for me, it's it's so amazing to see these films together as a continuing story, but they feel so different. You know what I mean? And I just but they both work beautifully in their own ways. Just visually, it's a feast for the eyes. It's a just a darkly witty script brought to life by an amazing cast, and above all, just a showcase for the one and only Vincent Price, just proven, well, in my opinion, as the king of Scream Macabre, and it's just abominably good indeed. So definitely check it out as well. So anyone that hasn't seen the first film, go watch the first film and definitely check out Dr. Fives Rises Again right after. But moving on now, the next film we'll be talking about is a film that I had never seen before. And this one doesn't feature Vincent Price, unfortunately, but we're going to go back to talking about the other two masters of macabre for this series, which is Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. And this movie came. This is nothing but the night from 1973. Um, and after years of watching Hammer classics and the Amicus anthologies, and just various other gothic classics, um, I finally got around to watching this film that I had been sitting on my must see Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing list for ages now, it seems. Um, but 1973's Nothing But the Night. And as a devout fan, an admirer of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, um, just seeing them together as always on screen is really the primary draw, I think, with these films that they're involved in together. Um, especially in films that I haven't experienced before. So, I mean, it's a high possibility that I would never have sit down and watch this movie. I mean, well, I don't want to say that. I mean, I could have sit and watched this movie, but like the main draw for me to want to watch this movie was Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. Um, and this movie, like I said, was made in 1973. It was directed by Peter Sadsdy, and it was based on this novel by a guy named John Blackburn. So it features Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing in the lead roles, and they head up this cast that includes names like Diana Dors, Georgia Brown, and even a young Michael Gambon, which was a pleasant surprise to see. Um, and so the plot here it promised this kind of mysterious series of deaths. Creepy children. This remote Scottish island, just and this investigation that's it's led by I think one of my favorite horror duos of all time. So, um, you know, why would I not watch this movie? I mean, it's just it seems so appealing with that kind of description, and just the whole Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing factor. I mean, like I said, let's be honest. This is why most of us genre fans seek out this film. And on that front, the film absolutely delivers the goods. I think this is a great film. It's one of those slow burn films where you kind of just have to keep watching for it to really start to kind of pick up. And the further the film goes on, the better and better it gets. Um, so we see Christopher Lee as Colonel Charles Bingham. He's this inspector, and Peter Cushing as Sir Mark Ashley, who is this doctor and friend, collaborating is just see them collaborate together is just a real treat. I think so. We're so used to seeing them kind of locked in almost Mortal Kombat. If you when Peter Cushing is Helsing, and Christopher Lee is Dracula. Um, so to see these guys work together for a change, it's definitely definitely refreshing. Sometimes I have to say words a few times before it comes out the way I want it to. But anyway, they kind of have their usual incredible screen presence and their chemistry. Even outside that kind of familiar Hammer setting that we know them the best for. It's just it's great. I mean, it's this is it's just great to see them have such great chemistry with one another. And Christopher Lee, he brings that kind of characteristic intensity to the role of this investigator that he plays, and Peter Cushing, he just his portrayal of Mark with his just kind of that typical blend of warmth and intelligence and vulnerability. Um, they feel like genuine old friends working together to kind of solve this terrifying puzzle. So, even when the plot gets a bit convoluted at times, which it does, trust me, just their performances really anchor this film beautifully. Um, you know, their scenes together are kind of, I think, are undoubtedly the highlight. That full of measured dialogue and just kind of shared glances between one another. That only actors with their history could really achieve. Um, and just diving into the film itself, it starts, like I said, with this kind of series of mysterious, supposedly accidental deaths amongst these wealthy trustees that are connected to a school for orphans on this remote Scottish island. So things escalate quickly with this fiery bus incident involving the children. This sets up this kind of rather complex mystery that evolves into something I think far more sinister and unsettling. But I don't want to give anything away because um, the reveal is quite like shocking. So and it's that I think it's what one of the reveal of what happens with this film is one of the best parts of the film. But, like I said, the film, it blends those elements of, like, folk horror, remote island, local secrets, and supernatural horror with, like, these weird seizures and these creepy kids and just, that whole police procedural thriller aspect. Just the atmosphere is just effectively built here, making good, use of the Scottish location, and then director Peter Sasdy, he's known for his work with Hammer, both Hammer and Amicus, and he brings this solid workmanlike approach to this film. While not perhaps as visually distinctive as say a Terrence Fisher Hammer film, um, Peter Sasdy really maintains that consistent tone of unease, especially with this film. And going back to the plot, as mentioned, it starts to be more and more intriguing as it progresses throughout the film, and it becomes more complex. As both Ashley and Bingham they start to dig deeper into what's going on here, um, and just that inclusion of Diana Dors as Anna. It really adds that another layer of mystery and just kind of touch of star power, beyond the leads. Um, and then Gwyneth Strong, the little girl in the film that plays Mary. Um, just all her scenes are just so unsettling. Um, and I'll leave it at that. So I can't really go any more than that. But just the whole core concept behind the horror is just quite unnerving. Um, it really deals with like themes of age and identity and something kind of ancient and terrifying. And that's all. I'll leave it at that. So if you've never seen this film, I don't want to say any more about that. But like I said, as a first time viewer of this film, I found the plot, a little dense at first. Uh, perhaps it's not always clearly explained, but I think it's always best to watch a film like this more than once. So after you watch it through your first time and then you watch it again, you'd be like, oh, okay, that makes more sense. That makes more sense. So, and it becomes more clear to you on the second watch, um, especially towards the climax of the film. Um, and some of the reveals, although they feel kind of rushed, and certain character motivations could have been fleshed out a bit more. Um, the pacing is absolutely deliberate here. It's perhaps a bit slow in some places of the film, but it it really allows that mystery to unfold. So it's purposely paced that way for a reason. So I'll just say that. And beyond Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, just I mentioned Michael Gambon being in this as well, and this was a very early role for him, and that was super cool to see him in this. And again, Diana Dors, just brings that certain presence to the film. Just all the supporting cast, just all contribute effectively to the whole eerie mood with this film. Um, and going back to Peter Sazzy, the director, he worked frequently in a lot of British genres, cinema during the late '60s and '70s. He directed several films for Hammer, like Taste of Blood of Dracula with Christopher Lee, and he also did some stuff with Amicus, like Hands of the Ripper. Just his style is just generally, I think, competent and just focused on just delivering, that's the script's thrills and an atmosphere rather than the kind of flamboyant visuals. Um, but Nothing But the Night fits squarely within this. It's well made. I think it tells its story effectively. And creates a lot of tension. Um, Even if it lacks, kind of the iconic look of some of its contemporaries, um, I think this movie is excellent, and it's definitely one you want to check out. But it isn't widely known or celebrated, as many of other Christopher Lee or Peter Cushing's kind of Hammer collaborations, or with or either of their collaborations with the Amicus films. It doesn't have that same, iconic status as Dracula or Frankenstein. It its legacy is more as a strong, slightly off kilter entry in the whole British horror slash thriller output of the early 1970s. Um, and particularly, just as a noteworthy film where Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing share that significant screen time as allies. Um, And again, going back to just the fans of these two, for Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing fans, the impact that this film has, I think, is just significant because it showcases their enduring friendship and just that professional rapport, in a kind of different context. It's a film that I think was, sought out specifically because they are in it together. I know that's why I sought this movie out, and just their presence really is the main reason it remains discussed, and watched by a lot of genre enthusiasts today. It's not a film that reinvented horror or anything, but it's a solid piece of just that unsettling cinema that really benefits, immeasurably from from the caliber of these two leading men. It's a cult film, just cherished by people out there. I think who appreciate this. That whole era of British horror. And it's just one that I've heard a lot of people in my friends groups talk about this film for years and years, and just but for some reason I never watched it, but I finally watched this, and I'm so glad that I did. And just seeing that unique partnership of these two stars, Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, come together in this is just it's unforgettable in my opinion. I think so. Definitely check out this movie and just everything about it. I feel like over time is top notch. Like I said, it's a slow burn film, but it's one of those films where you got to watch more than once to kind of understand and get a clear um, understanding of everything that's happening within the film. Um, so check this movie out. I mean, just it's like you won't regret it. But moving on to the next film that I am very familiar with. And in this next film, we're going back to talking about the man himself, Vincent Price. So in this next film, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee are unfortunately absent in this film, but this is another one of my favorite Vincent Price movies. Even though he's only in kind of the wraparound sense, because this is an anthology film. And even though he's just in kind of the wraparound segments, I love his performance in this. So I don't know if I would say this. I don't know. I take that back. I don't know if this would be one of my favorite Vincent Price films, but it's definitely my favorite Vincent Price film. Where it is an anthology film, and this is the Monster Club from 1981. And I've seen this movie dozens of times because it's up there as probably one of my favorite anthology films ever. Um, but just the title itself, the Monster Club, it really just kind of conjures this certain image, and just it's a place where the creatures of the night gather and mingle, and perhaps kind of listen to some music and dance and but so who better to guide us into such an establishment than Vincent Price? And this film is often noted for being one of the later entries in his career, and just a fittingly eccentric one that at that. So it's this British anthology horror film, a format, that Vincent Price was no stranger to, having starred in, stone cold classics like Torture Garden and From Beyond the Grave. Um, while this wasn't an Amicus production itself, the ghost of Amicus, you could say, looms large over this film. Particularly through the involvement of Milton Subotsky, which was this is his final film, and just the casting choices and the in jokes here, just that screams the Amicus reunion within this film. So from the moment that our eyes land on Vincent Price as Aramis, I think is his name in this, but so he's this vampire. He's very charming, slightly peckish, but he's this vampire that you're in for something special, or at least something uniquely Vincent Price. Um, so he kind of glides through, the prologue and all the framing segments with that the wraparound segments with that kind of familiar debonair ease. It just his voice again. Like I spoke about before, just that is perfectly modulated. It almost like an instrument of theatricality. So the premise with the Monster Club, where he bites this author R. Chetwynd Hayes, who's played by John Carradine, who John Carradine himself, a horror veteran, though sadly I think underused here. Um, so he bites his character Arch Etwin Hayes, and then invites him to this secret society, which is just pure, I think, pulp delight. And excuse me, I need to get a drink real quick. All right, so got my drink, my peach knee high. So back to what I was saying. Just he invites him to this secret society, and just what we get, following all that is just pure pulp delight. I think, it sets the tone. Um, and don't take this too seriously. I mean, don't take this film too seriously at all. Just enjoy the ride here. So the club itself is this wonderfully like schlocky creation. It's a smoky, dimly lit den filled with all manner of just kind of rubbery, sometimes unconvincing monsters like vampires, werewolves, mummies, ghouls, hybrids you've never heard of. It's like a monster mashup that feels both budget conscious, and if you watch the movie, you know what I mean by that. But it's just surprisingly fun, and the musical numbers throughout the film inside the club are um, rather divisive element of the film. I know some people don't really care for those, but I think that's what makes it even more special and appealing to me, in my opinion. Um, and just these kind of bizarre inclusions that that interrupt the flow, but kind of add to that overall chaotic charm. I think. Um, like a Miss Monster rock band, a stripper shedding fake skin, where you and she turns out to be a skeleton. It's just entertainingly weird. And Vincent Price, as our host, just navigates it all with, just that elegant charm that he's known for. Just in introducing all these stories that we're going to be breaking down here soon. So let's get right into that and break down these segments from a fan's perspective at least. So the first segment about the Shadmock. So the Shadmock, this is probably the most gothic and perhaps a segment that aims for genuine tragedy. This actually might be my favorite story out of the three stories that will be told in this film. So the concept of the Shadmock, which is played by James Lawrenson, is a creature who has this whistle that dissolves things, and it's original, yet rather sad. So Barbara Kellerman is effective in this as Angela, who's the woman that is caught between desperation and greed, and the story has a touch of that kind of classic amicus moral comeuppance, but it feels a bit rushed. I mean, the makeup for the Shadmock is decent for the era, and the whistle, well, destruction, I guess you call it, is just momentarily shocking. Um, it's a solid enough opener, but like I said, it leans more towards that kind of melancholic horror than outright scares. But as far as story wise, I think this is definitely my favorite out of the three. But I don't know. I mean, it always is. It's changed with me over the years. Like right now, this is probably my favorite story out of the three. Um, Previously, it was the third story, which I'll be talking about here in a little bit. But like I said, it's always changing. But overall, this entire film is just great. So definitely check it out if you haven't. But getting back into the to the second story told here, which is the vampires. I really love this one too because this includes Donald Pleasance. Um, so this is where the tone kind of takes a sudden left turn into comedic horror. As the first story was more kind of a serious story, there's more the comedic elements come out in the second one about the vampires. So this very timid vampire son, and it's like peaceful vampire family, and also there's this kind of bureaucratic team of vampire hunters, which is led by Donald Pleasance. Um, this segment is just very overtly humorous and just relies more on like farce and slapstick. Um, and you know it's not particularly frightening or anything, but the humor is really what elevates it. And the performances here, especially from Donald Pleasance. And he Donald Pleasance, he shared the screen um with Vincent Price in The Great Mouse Detective years later. Well, not really shared the screen, but their voices were both present in that film. Um, and it's just a joy to watch these two working, even though they're not in the same segments in this film, but them just working together on this film as a whole. Is just very it's a huge joy to watch. They're both completely committed to the absurdity throughout this film. Um, it just feels like the vampire segment here. It feels like a horror segment mixed with like a dark comedy sketch. It's kind of been shoehorned in, but it's undeniably entertaining in its own way. And just Vincent Price's intro here feels like a kind of slightly cheeky wink, to the audience. Again, just watch the film and you'll understand what I mean if you're a Vincent Price fan. Um, but getting to the last segment of this, which I said is a very close second. At one point, this was my favorite one, and it could be at another point. The more times I watch this, the more my feelings change on the film. But the last segment, which is about the ghouls, so this segment really gets us back closer to traditional horror anthology territory, which is that kind of healthy dose of atmosphere and grimness. And the director of this segment, Stuart Whitman, he or, I'm sorry, not the director of the segment, but the director character in this segment, which is played by Stuart Whitman. He stumbles upon this village is just populated by these corpse eating ghouls. And the atmosphere of this little small town called Loftville is suitably bleak and unsettling. It's reminiscent of some of Amicus's bleaker tales from the past. Um, Patrick McGee pops up briefly as this creepy innkeeper, and which adds more, I think, familiar horror pedigree to the segment. And just the concept of the ghouls, interbreeding with humans is just effectively unsettling. And Leslie Dunlop as Luna, the Hum Ghoul, just provides that kind of emotional core. This tragic figure caught between two worlds. Um, and the ending of this segment is particularly like downbeat, which feels more in the vein of like late era British horror that wasn't afraid of bleakness. This one probably feels the most like a classic anthology segment in structure and tone. Though the ghouls themselves are perhaps not the most terrifyingly realized creatures. Um, Vincent Price introduces this one with a kind of touch more of like hinting at the darker nature of the creatures. Um, but getting back to more about on Vincent Price, throughout the film, he's the anchor in when it comes to the film in the wraparound segments. Um, just his performance as Aramis, isn't physically demanding, but just his sheer presence once again, his delivery of dialogue and his interactions with the other characters, especially just the brief moments in the segments with Carradine, with John Carradine, and just all these other various like monstrous patrons at the club. It just really holds the framing story together. He's that charming ringleader, that guide through his this kind of menagerie of the bizarre. So for a Vincent Price fan, just watching him preside over this weird, wonderful club is really the main event here. Um, and just let's kind of focus on these kind of amicus in jokes that are throughout the film. So I think this is where the film really rewards the kind of dedicated fan of British horror of this era. So just knowing Milton Sabotsky was involved, makes that kind of an anagram of his name into the character Linton Basotsky, which is played by Anthony Steele, a very genuinely funny nod. And Basotsky's mention of a film called From Beyond the Tombstone is a very clear wink, to Amicus's From Beyond the Grave, and just seeing familiar faces like Patrick McGee from Asylum and many others, Britt Eklund, who's also from Asylum, though her role as Mrs. Basotsky is small, and Jeffrey Belladon, which is the psychiatrist, which is another Asylum alumni, just feels like crashing an Amicus cast party. These little touches are fan service, I think, done right. Reinforcing the film's lineage, even if it doesn't quite reach the consistent quality of the Amicus heydays. Um, and speaking of lineage, the provided text notes um, with this final feature film for Roy Ward Baker as director. Baker was a prolific director with credits ranging from mainstream dramas like Titanic to iconic horror, including several for Hammer like Quartermass and The Pit. Um, And I guess significantly, Amicus anthologies like Asylum, The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. So while this is not an Amicus film, its director and producer were steeped in that world, which explains, the feel of and the in jokes here, surrounding that whole legacy of Amicus Productions. But for Baker, it was a um, Roy Ward Baker, who was the director here. This was a swan song, I guess, for him per se. That it doesn't showcase his best work that's out there, but it just ties back, nicely to his horror roots. And and that's why I love this film so much, and I've watched it so many times because there's just so many nods to that whole era of British horror. Um, while this was not the greatest horror anthology or British horror that involves all these names like Vincent Price and everyone involved here, it's definitely like a huge nod and tribute to that whole era. And just that's why I enjoy it so much, and just the whole legacy that this film brings is perhaps like I said, less about groundbreaking horror or cinematic artistry or anything like that, um, but it's just more about its status as a late era, curiosity and just that specific point for fans of the cast and the genre itself. Um, I don't think a lot of people would regard this one as a horror classic. Now I look at it a little bit differently, but I'm biased in a lot of ways when it comes to this film, though. But I think people often see this film as more of a campy and uneven at times. But yeah, I just think for fans of Vincent Price, of Milton Sabotsky, of Roy Ward Baker, of British anthology horror, it's definitely, essential, I think. And even if it's a minor piece of the puzzle, I still think it's very essential to watch this film. It represents that transitional moment, that final hurrah for some of these talents in this format that they helped popularize. So The film's ultimate message, which is delivered by Vincent Price, um, that humans are the most despicable monsters of all. And I think that's classic. It's darkly humorous. This sentiment that really resonates and fits perfectly coming from Vincent Price. Um, it solidifies the film's place as a knowing, or slightly cynical, look at all these different themes in horror. Even if it's delivered with just a light touch, it's kept alive by fans, who appreciate its unique blend of that B movie charm, the horror history nods, and just most importantly, that enduring charisma of Vincent Price. Um, but I guess in conclusion, when it comes to the Monster Club, um, just from the perspective of a fan, just of the film itself, from a Vincent Price fan, um, the Monster Club is by no means a perfect film. There's times where the pacing is kind of uneven. The shifts in tone in between segments are kind of they're a little bit weird, and just some of the effects and the musical numbers. Um, while I enjoy them personally, I know they're not super popular with a lot of fans out there. Um, but however, none of that truly matters. I think when Vincent Price is on screen, just kind of that radiating that effortless charm. As the narrator here, he is the reason to watch this movie. Like, and I'm gonna be honest, he's the very reason why I decided to watch this movie so many years ago for the first time. He's the main reason why I watched this movie over and over throughout the years. Um, so just all the connecting segments are definitely a delight thanks to him, and just all the connections to Amicus Productions is just a fantastic bonus, for anyone that kind of steeped in that particular era of horror. Just that all the individual stories told here, they all vary in kind of quality and tone, um, but they all definitely contribute to that whole compelling appeal. Um, is it a must see for everyone? Maybe not. But is it a must see for anyone who loves Vincent Price, British horror anthologies, and just, those super weird B movies out there? Absolutely. Um, it has its flaws, but very charming like flaws. Um, Historically, it's interesting and just I think thoroughly unique. It's very unique in its own way, um, and just it was elevated, in my opinion, significantly by the presence of Vincent Price, the master himself. Um, so if you've never seen this movie, definitely um, just put it down on your list of movies to watch. Let me know if you've never seen this movie, and once you've watched it, let me know in the comments below how you feel personally about this movie. But I just think it's a special occasion every time I watch this film. So yeah, so check it out. I don't think you'll regret it, but I could be wrong. But moving on to the next film and the last film that I'm gonna be talking about when it comes to the Masters of Macabre, Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, and Peter Cushing. And I felt like it was only fitting to end this little mini series talking about these masters of horror by talking about a film where they're all involved in the same film. And unfortunately, this would be the last film that they would all share together. Um, and this is House of the Long Shadows from 1983. So for fans who grew up watching all three of these guys, Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, just the very concept of House of the Long Shadows is gothic heaven for fans. Just the promise of seeing not just these three titans, but also John Carradine once again, just like in the Monster Club with Vincent Price, John Carradine sharing the screen once again, and this would be the first and only time that all four of those guys would be in a film together. So this film is really like an event, plain and simple. I mean, regardless of the plot here, approaching this movie, just the primary goal isn't necessarily seeing groundbreaking horror or a flawless narrative or anything, but just rather to kind of bask in that collective presence of all four of these legends here. So what is this movie? So from a fan's perspective, in simple terms, House of the Long Shadows is this gothic comedy horror mystery film that was released in 1983. However, its true identity, especially for fans like myself, is that it's one of the very rare instances, like I said before, where four absolute giants of horror cinema were brought together on screen in Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, and John Carradine. And it's a film that built almost entirely on the premise of seeing these icons share the same space, same dialogue, and just that same eerie atmosphere. And the plot revolves around this young American writer named Kenneth McGee, who's played by Desi Arnaz Jr. And he makes this bet for $20,000 with his publisher that he can write this Wuthering Heights style novel in just 24 hours. And to get into the proper mood, he chooses to isolate himself in this kind of seemingly deserted Welsh manor house called Bloodpatir Manor, I think is how he pronounces it. So upon arrival at this manor, he discovers that the house is far from empty. And what he discovers that it's been inhabited by this very eccentric, secretive, and just very strange Brisbane family, and these other visitors that arrive at the manor, such as Mr. Corrigan, played by Christopher Lee. So as Kenneth, settles in or tries to at least, all these different strange events start to unfold. These old family secrets start to surface, and just the line between reality and potential madness begins to blur. Um, it's a classic, stranger arrives at a creepy house full of secrets set up. Um, and it's designed specifically to allow this legendary cast of horror legends just to kind of inhabit these mysterious roles. Um, but the real treat here, this is where the film truly delivers for fans. Just a chance to see Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing interact, and even if it's just brief moments, I think is that again, like some of the films I spoke about before, is just the film's kind of undeniable selling point and just the main success. Um, so starting with Vincent Price, he plays the role of Lionel Grisbane, and um, Vincent Price just brings that signature blend, of that theatricality and wit, and just a touch of the sinister that we know him for. Um, he's utterly charming and just commands the screen, whenever he appears. His delivery of his lines is just perfect. Finding the humor and that kind of underlying menace in his lines. Just every time he's on screen, you cannot take your eyes off of him. Um, and then moving on, Christopher Lee, who plays Mr. Corrigan. Christopher Lee is just, that imposing presence that you expect. He has that incredible intensity that just makes even simple dialogue, feel significant. Um, whether he's being mysterious or authoritative or something else entirely, you know, he much like Vincent Price, when he is on screen, he is magnetic. You can't take your eyes off of him. his stature and his voice are just kind of used to the full effect here, just really adding weight to the ensemble in this film. And lastly, well, I'll talk about John Carradine as well, but next I want to talk about Peter Cushing. So he plays the Sebastian Grisbane, who is the brother of Vincent Price's character. Um, so Peter Cushing, just kind of provides his usual class and that quiet strength. He often plays characters who are perhaps more outwardly fragile or nervous than Vincent Price or Christopher Lee would play, but always just with this undeniable inner steel or intelligence. He really brings a sense of dignity and groundedness, relatively speaking, for this film, to just the whole proceedings. Often reacting to just that unfolding madness with his his characteristic stiff upper lip or his worried frown. Just that's one of the things that just always appealed to me about Peter Cushing is like just he was like one of those guys that you could just get reactions out of an audience based off of his facial features. Um, and I think a lot of that is kind of highlighted in his roles in the Hammer films. But we see some of that here in the House of the Long Shadows, and he just, again, as always, is just absolutely legendary performance as the rest of these guys. But I do have to speak on John Carradine as well, because John Carradine, even though he was not really featured in this little mini series that I've where I've talked about these films, um, he's just as much of a legend as the rest of these guys. And in this one, he portrays Lord Elijah Grisbane. And, like I said, while the focus for me is on that main three, Vincent Price, Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, John Carradine's inclusion as this, you know, as the family patriarch here is just a fantastic bonus. He adds that another layer of, vintage horror royalty to the mix, and just his whole presence is just a welcome addition, to that macabre family gathering. But just watching all of these actors together, you really get a real sense, of their individual styles, contrasting and at times, complementing each other. Um, just the film really gives each of them, moments to shine, and utilizing their unique strengths. And, the dialogue scenes where, two or more of them are present are the highlights, I feel, in my opinion. Just it really offers this kind of nostalgic glimpse, per se, of that golden age of horror cinema. But Pete Walker is known for his kind of distinct brand of British exploitation horror in the 70s, like Frightmare and House of Whipcord and Schizo. And he often kind of injected this kind of sense of grime and psychological unease and just kind of like dark humor into his work. But with House of the Long Shadows, with this kind of presence, of these classic stars and the source material, which this was based on a play or a novel, I believe. Um, but just his style really feels, somewhat reined in compared to his earlier, grittier efforts. Uh, the atmosphere within this film is suitably gothic. The old manor house looks like it looks the part. The stormy night is just a perfect cliche to go along with it, and just the interiors, are full of shadows and just creaking doors. And does it achieve genuine lasting horror? I mean, perhaps less so. I mean, I don't know. But the film leans heavily on those jump scares and reveals within the mystery framework. The comedy aspect can feel a bit uneven at times, but is the humor intentional character interplay, or is it kind of veering into camp? That's the question here. It's arguably a bit of both, which kind of fits the overall tone of the film. If you know how everything turns out. So, and I don't want to spoil that in case you have not seen the film, but just I think that it really kind of it's all very fitting in the end, and it just and that that knows its main draw is the cast rather than bone chilling terror or whatever. Um, but Pete Walker, he handles the pacing, well enough, just to keep things kind of moving through the mystery and ensuring the audience is introduced to these various characters and the central premise efficiently. However, the film's main strength isn't subtle dread but the kind of fun of the unfolding that is occurring throughout the film. Um, it's this increasingly absurd situation, and just the reactions, of all the cast in the film is really what makes this movie so great. Um, but just to kind of look at this in a non-spoiler way, in case somebody's watching that has never seen this movie. I know my wife has never seen this movie, so if she's watching this, I don't want to spoil this for her, because what how this movie turns out is absolutely brilliant, and I love it. I love how this movie ends. Um, but again, with Christopher Lee, with Peter Cushing, with Vincent Price, and even including John Carradine in the mix there, this is essential viewing for any fans out there of any of those guys. Now, is it a masterpiece of horror? Maybe not. I mean, I think this movie is absolutely amazing. I love it. It's another one that I've seen multiple times. Is the plot um, is the plot the most airtight or logical you know uh, plot ever conceived? I mean, that's debatable. Let's just leave it there. That's debatable, but you know, and even the younger cast members, do they hold their own against the legends here that's presented in this film? Very rarely. So, like I said, I think the main appeal is with this one, much like some of the other films I've talked about, is the legends that are involved. But all of what I've talked about, whether it be the logic, being debatable, is it a masterpiece? I mean, to some people, I don't think it's a masterpiece, but I do love this movie. But none of that truly matters when you get to see Vincent Price, delivering a line with that familiar twinkle in his eye, or Christopher Lee, looking impossibly sinister as always, or Peter Cushing, just trying to maintain composure amidst all the chaos. The film is very charming, slightly campy, just an old fashioned mystery thriller that serves primarily as this vehicle, um, as the final precious opportunity to see all these giants of horror, of that whole genre just sharing the screen together for with John Carradine for the first and only time, and for Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, and Vincent Price. This would be the last time that all three of those would share the screen together. Um, it's just a very historical, curio as much as a film, representing a passing of the torch, or just perhaps just one last glorious flicker of light from that classic era. Um, you watch it for these guys, and they don't disappoint. In their ability to elevate even the most standard material with this kind of sheer presence and skill, and just the charm that all of these guys were known for throughout their careers. It is this kind of, I feel like it's a required entry in that filmography checklist for any serious fan for any of these guys. Um, So, just enjoy it for that legendary ensemble, the gothic trappings, the sheer fun of just seeing them together one last time. Um, but with that, I guess, that is it, guys, for this video. Um, I had a lot of fun, and I'm sorry that it took me so long to even uh, complete this two-part series of the Masters of Macabre. Again, I talked about that at the beginning of the video, why it took so long, but everything's good now. We should be back on normal track now, so I'll be back next week, or I guess next Sunday, with another video, and it's going to be a kind of a collaboration. So um, it's it's going to be a Freddy versus Jason video we putting together. So normally when I come on here, I talk about these movies I watched and just kind of go break them down one by one. Next Sunday's show is going to be a little bit different. So I'm going to be talking about the Nightmare on Elm Street films and the Friday the 13th films, and just basically just how I feel about them as a whole, um, which films I like better. So we'll be kind of doing like Nightmare on Elm Street versus Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street 2 versus Friday the 13th Part 2, and so forth. Or, just however, we're basically just going to kind of throw this together. I'm going to be giving you a lot of stories from when I was a kid growing up, my introduction to those films, and just, how important to me they are as franchises as a horror fan growing up. So that was going to be a lot of fun. Just still kind of, and that's just kind of like um, an early stage idea for that video. There's still some things I'm trying to work on, piece together, see how I want to talk about everything in that video. Because like I said, it's all going to be within one, so that's going to be covering how many films is that? So you got all the Friday 13th films, and the Nightmare on Elm Street films up to Freddy versus Jason. So I'll be watching all those films, but just like I said, where there's so many, and I'm going to kind of compile them all into one video. It's I'm not going to be like really elaborately talking about each movie in detail, but it's just well, you guys just you'll tune in if you want, if you're interested in that. Just tune in next Sunday, and what you see is what you'll get. But and hey, what's going on, Pop, man? You just caught me right at the end of the video. So yeah, I was just finishing this one up. I was just telling everyone that next week I'm gonna be doing a Freddy versus Jason video where we'll be talking about all the Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th films. Um, and yeah, so that one's gonna be fun. And if you, I'd love for you to check that out if you have the time. But thanks for popping in here towards the end of the video, man. I really appreciate that. Um, but I guess that's it, guys. Like I said, I really enjoyed doing this little mini series of the Masters of Macabre, talking about the legends of Vincent Price and Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. I hope you guys enjoyed, watching these videos as much as I did putting them together. Um, so I want to thank everyone who watched this live, uh, or was watching this on the replay. Um, please just drop me a comment below on what your favorite Vincent Price movie is, or your favorite Christopher Lee, or favorite Peter Cushing movies. Um, and if, as always, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. If you're new to the channel, please hit the subscribe button to catch more videos from me like this one. Um, because I got a lot more movies I'm gonna be talking about for the rest of this year and this 500 movies in 2025 series. So if you're just now new to the channel, go back and check out all the other videos that I've done in the past for the past 6 months, and just a lot more fun stuff in store coming up for the rest of the year. And just, so click that bell for any kind of future notifications. But with all that said, I'm Crater. This is Crater Mania. I love you guys. Have a good night.